Chapter 29 of Brenda, Her School, and Her Club by Helen Leah Reed. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 29 After Vacation. On Monday morning, as might have been expected, Brenda did not awake very early, and though she had a few uneasy moments as she thought of Mrs. Rosa, on the whole she was too much absorbed by her preparations for school to worry over what had now become a very unpleasant subject to her. At school all was bustle and excitement for the quarter hour preceding the opening. Some of the girls had been in New York, or even as far as Washington during the vacation, and they had much to tell of their doings. Even those girls who had remained in Boston had had very exciting experiences, or at least this seemed to have been the case, judging by the eager tones in which they talked, and the effort of each girl to make herself heard above all the others. If there had been nothing else eventful among the girls of the set to which the four belonged, the bazaar would have afforded abundant food for discussion. Even the older girls were interested in this affair, and felt proud of the success of their schoolmates. This morning, too, was an exciting one at the school, because it marked the beginning of the spring term, the last term of regular school for several of Miss Crawdon's pupils, who next year were to take their place in society. Already in their spring gowns, modeled after the styles of their elders, they looked like young women, and their sweeping skirts and elaborate hats seemed to put a gulf between them and their younger companions. Among the girls of intermediate age there was also a special reason for dreading the spring term, for during the few remaining weeks, two or three of them besides Ruth and Julia were to concentrate all their energy on preparation for the preliminary college examinations. Not all of these girls were likely to go to college, but Miss Crawdon had encouraged them to prepare for the examinations, hoping that their success in passing might lead them eventually to take the college course. Even these girls, the less frivolous in the school, were chattering, or perhaps I should say talking, as eagerly as the others. They had many little points to talk over regarding the requirements for college, the special tutoring they might need, and similar things. Julia, although she had been conscientious in her work during the winter, really did dread the coming ordeal. Examinations of any kind were new to her, for until the past winter her studies had always been carried on in an individual way. It was still a sore point with Brenda that Julia should think of going to college. She felt certain that teaching was her cousin's ultimate aim, and she did not like the idea at all. A few years before this Brenda had been remarkably free from anything resembling snobbishness. This may have been partly on account of her youth, although a more probable reason was that she had not in her earlier days so many snobbish friends to influence her, for in spite of her intimacy with Nora and Edith, Brenda permitted herself to be too greatly influenced by Belle. Frances Pounder, too, was only one of a group of girls much less simple-minded than Brenda, whom the latter had come to associate with rather closely. Any one of them would have indignantly denied a special regard for money. They would have been pained had you said that they made wealth a consideration in choosing their friends, yet this was what it amounted to, their way of cavilling at those who did not belong to their set. They said that family was the only consideration with them, but I doubt that a very poor girl, however good her family, would have been considered by them as welcome as any richer girl of poorer family. There was Julia, for example, who had in every way as strong a claim to consideration as Brenda, for were not the two cousins? Yet Frances invariably had some little supercilious thing to say about Julia, except in the presence of Nora and Edith, and the superciliousness came largely from the fact that she regarded Julia as a poor relation of the Barlows. "She can never be of any great use," Frances had reasoned to us, including in the latter term all the girls with whom she was intimate, "and therefore what is the good in pretending to be fond of a strong-minded girl who may in a few years be a teacher in a public school? I honestly think she would just as soon as not teach in a public school, Brenda, for I heard her praising public schools to the sky the other day. I'm sure I wonder that she does not go to a public school instead of to Miss Crawdon's. It would save your father and mother a lot of money," concluded Frances, forgetting that how Mr. and Mrs. Barlow spent their money was really no concern of hers. At times Frances laid aside her good manners. Brenda never knew just how to respond to speeches of this kind, and their chief effect was a little feeling of irritation that a cousin of hers should have put herself in this position of being classed with mere wage earners. Brenda was no longer jealous of Julia in the ordinary sense. She had begun to lose the childish pettiness of her earlier years. Observation was teaching her that even in the one household there could be room for two girls near the same age, and that any privileges or affection accorded Julia did not interfere with her own rights. Indeed, had she been perfectly honest with herself, she would have admitted that Julia's companionship during the past winter had really been of great value to her. If any one were to tell her that Julia was not to be in the house with her another year, she would have admitted that she would be lonely. In spite of the childishness which Brenda sometimes showed towards her cousin, the two girls saw a great deal of each other, and Brenda had lately acquired the habit of slipping into her cousin's room on her way up and down stairs to talk over little happenings of one kind or another. But at school on this bright spring morning, Brenda felt some irritation at the sight of Julia and Ruth in close consultation with the Greek teacher. "He has such sharp eyes," whispered Frances, as she and Brenda passed him in the hallway. "Don't you feel as if he were looking right through you and saying, 'You're a little ignoramus. Every one is who does not study Greek with me.'" "Oh, how tiresome you are, Frances," responded Brenda crossly. "I dare say Miss Crawdon will say that too, in the English class at the close of the next hour, unless you have a better composition than I have." "Why, Brenda Barlow, I had forgotten all about it, and we were expected to have it ready this morning. Have you written yours?" "No," replied Brenda, "I forgot mine too. There were so many other things to think of last week." It happened, naturally enough, that Brenda and Frances and several other girls who had neglected their compositions in the same way, received a reprimand from Miss Crawdon, who thereupon said, "Since so little English written work has been handed in to-day, I will submit a composition of my own to you for criticism. It is very simple, and consists merely of a brief description of an evening party, supposed to be the work of a girl of about your age. Now listen. I have seldom had so nice a time as at Clara Gordon's party. In the first place, the house is a particularly nice one, and the room where we danced has the nicest floor for waltzing that I ever saw. Then there were so many nice people there, all the girls and young men whom I know especially well, and some others from out of town. The orchestra played divinely. I never heard nicer music, and John Brent, my partner in the German, was just as nice to me as he could be. I wish that I could describe the nice supper that we had at nice little tables in the dining room. There was every imaginable kind of nice thing, ices, salads, and cakes. The sherbet was so nice that some persons who sat down late could not get any. It was all gone. I got along very nicely, for John Brent looked out for me. I have not told you about the dresses, but they were all so nice that it is hard to say which was the nicest. I danced until I could hardly stand, for I was determined not to miss a single dance, but when my aunt tried to urge me to go home before 12 o'clock so that I wouldn't be tired to death, I wouldn't give in for a moment, but told her that I felt quite nicely." "There," said Miss Crawdon, "this is a longer composition than many of you have prepared to-day, and mine is voluntary, while many of you have failed to carry out what was really a command laid upon you. What do you think of my composition?" While she was reading, some of the girls had rubbed their eyes in amazement. It did not take even the duller very long, however, to see that Miss Crawdon had been playing a practical joke upon them. She had always had a great deal to say to them on the necessity of a wide vocabulary, and she had been particularly severe towards those girls who made the adjective "nice" take the place of more expressive words. "You noticed, perhaps," continued Miss Crawdon, "that I have not been extravagant in the matter of adjectives. At least I have been extravagant in the use of only one, for I have been able to make 'nice' serve in almost every instance where an adjective was needed, and in none of these instances was it used in its own proper sense. Those girls who had not previously seen the joke now glanced at one another in amazement. Yes, it really was a practical joke, this little composition by Miss Crawdon, and they had only begun to find it out. Then Miss Crawdon spoke again. "I will not pretend that my composition has cost me much effort. Indeed, I only wrote it here in school in the few minutes at my disposal before the opening hour. I need not say also that it is the result of a few hastily jotted notes, based on scraps of conversation which came to me as I passed various groups of my pupils at recess or before school. But seriously," and all eyes were fixed on her, "I do wish that you would avoid the word 'nice' altogether for the present, unless you can resist the temptation to make it do duty on all occasions. Now, hoping that you will take this lesson to heart, I will leave you to Miss South, who will talk to you for a quarter of an hour on the subject of letter writing." Thereupon Miss South took Miss Crawdon's place, and the girls had no opportunity to exchange opinions regarding Miss Crawdon's humorous if brief essay. Miss Crawdon and Miss South were joint teachers of this class in English. Miss South had charge of it oftener than Miss Crawdon, but the latter had general supervision of it, and as the first hour of certain mornings was given to it, occasionally Miss South was permitted to arrive at school a little late, while Miss Crawdon took her place. When Miss South was late, it was not on account of any dilatoriness of her own. It was usually business of Miss Crawdon's that detained her, for she was Miss Crawdon's trusted friend, and she often had to go to the bank, or to hold an interview with an anxious parent, or to do some other thing by which Miss Crawdon might be spared care or unnecessary steps. On this special Monday morning, however, Miss South was not only late, but she looked a little worried. Many of the girls had heard of the newly discovered relationship between her and Madame du Launy, and in the quarter hour before school the story of the discovery, with a few slight variations from accuracy, had been talked over very freely. When Miss South did not appear to take charge of the English class, most of her pupils assumed that she was no longer to be a teacher at Miss Crawdon's. They were therefore astonished when she entered the room, as ready to assume her school duties as if she had had no change of fortune. Yet, as I have said, Miss South looked a little worried, and her glance wandered 2 or 3 times in the direction of Brenda, in a way that caused Brenda's conscience to reassert itself. "Oh, dear," she thought, "what shall I do if Miss South has heard about that money? Of course it is no concern of hers, but still. Now Brenda did not know exactly what she dreaded, for her idea of the value of money was very vague. She only knew that she had not done right in leaving the $200 with Mrs. Rosa. Yet she consoled herself with the reflection, "At any rate, I have a third of that money safe at home, and that is a great deal to have saved if anything has happened to the rest." Nora, too, had come late to school, though Brenda had been too much carried away by the excitement of seeing the other girls again to notice this. Later in the morning Nora slipped into her accustomed place, and her face too, though Brenda had not observed it, looked a little more serious than usual. It was not until the end of school that the storm burst. At recess Nora, contrary to her usual custom, had remained at her desk studying. But after school she ran up to Brenda with an "Oh, how could you, Brenda? We have lost almost the whole advantage from the bazaar. Miss South and I were down at the Rosas this morning. I promised not to say anything to you until after school, and, well, Miss South will tell you. I can't bear to talk about it." "Brenda," said Miss South, drawing nearer, "I suppose that you would like me to tell you about Mrs. Rosa's money, yet I do not feel that it is a matter with which I ought to meddle. I had nothing to do with raising the money, only I have been interested in the plan by means of which you all wish to help the poor woman." "We all think that you have been very kind," interposed Nora politely. "Ah, I have been. I am very much interested in Mrs. Rosa and her family, and so I know is Brenda," for she saw a cloud settling on the young girl's face. "But you were not exactly wise, Brenda, in leaving that money with Mrs. Rosa." "Has it been stolen?" gasped Brenda. "Well, not exactly stolen, although Mrs. Rosa no longer has it." "Brenda," interrupted Nora, "I certainly begged you not to leave it there, though I never imagined that you would do so." "Well, Brenda," continued Miss South, "Nora received a letter this morning from Angelina, written apparently in great haste last night. What she said was very vague, but she spoke of the loss of $200 in such a way as to recall to Nora your suggestion that you might leave the money with Mrs. Rosa. Nora was so excited that she left her breakfast, so she tells me, almost untasted. She gave her mother a hasty account of what Angelina had told her, and her mother advised her to see me. The upshot was that we went at once to Mrs. Rosa's, and there we found that the young man who has been troubling her lately to pay a debt which he claimed that she owed his mother, had called to see her soon after you and Nora were at the house. He caught sight of the purse that you had left with Mrs. Rosa, and when her head was turned, pulled it from under the pillow and began to examine its contents. Naturally he was astonished to find that it contained $200, and when Mrs. Rosa saw him with the purse in his hand, he refused to give it up to her. The poor woman was alone and very weak, and so completely in his power that she could not refuse when he compelled her to tell him how the money had come into her possession. When he learned that it had been raised for her at a bazaar, and that it was to be used for her benefit, he seemed very much pleased. "It is really your own," he said, "or else the young ladies would not have left it with you. If it is to do you any good, you had better give it to me to keep you out of prison, for that is where I shall send you for not paying your debts unless you give me this money." So, by continued threats, he finally made her sign a paper, saying that she paid the money willingly to rid herself of a debt owed to his mother. He even made her think that he had done her a great favor in not trying to get the $50, the balance of the debt which he claimed. Brenda had listened with an almost dazed expression while Miss South told this strange story. "But he did not really take it, did he?" she murmured. "He not only took it," said Miss South, "but we have reason to think that he has left the country with it. His friends say that he had been getting ready for weeks to go to South America, and that he expected to sail from New York this morning." "Can't he be stopped?" asked Brenda. Her voice sounded very weak, and her face was not at all the face of the usually cheerful young girl. "He cannot be stopped now, Brenda, and I doubt if in any case we could recover the money. He was very clever in getting Mrs. Rosa to sign that paper. If he were in Boston we might recover the money on the ground that it did not belong to Mrs. Rosa, and that therefore she had no right to give it away, but we can hardly make that a ground for any action now. Besides, I know that she thought that the money belonged to her. In some way you gave her that impression, and any testimony of hers would not help us very much if you had a case in court against young Silva." "But she knew," moaned poor Brenda, "that the money was only to help her to go to the country. I am sure that I said that to her." "You cannot expect a woman of her limited intelligence, a foreigner too, who only half understands English, to grasp the meaning of all that is said to her. The fact was clear to her that you had brought her some money, and when her creditor claimed it, she believed that he had a right to it, and that to use it in this way would benefit her more than to spend it in going to the country." "Well, it seems to me that she just deceived me," cried Brenda angrily. "No," responded Nora, "you must be fair. Miss South and I both believe that she didn't mean to do anything with the money when she took it from you, but she thought that you had given it to her, and she never has been as anxious to move from the city as we have been to have her," continued Miss South. "Yet it is so much the best thing, and our plans are all carefully made, that I hope we can carry them out." "I have $100 at home," said Brenda, "but, oh dear, I do not like to think about it. How angry Belle and Edith will be. Do they know yet?" "No," said Miss South, "I thought it better to tell you first. Nora and I are the only persons except Mrs. Rosa and her friends who know anything about the money. But of course you must tell the other girls as well as your father and mother. It might be worth while for them to consult a lawyer, at least they might feel better satisfied. For my own part, I am confident that the money cannot be recovered." "Come, come, Brenda, now do cheer up," cried Nora. "It's no use crying about spilled milk, and perhaps we can think of some way to straighten things out." "I might sell my watch," said Brenda, as they walked away from the school, "and give up my allowance for the rest of the year, for it is just as if I had thrown that money away, and we all worked so hard for it." "Well, we all had a good time out of the bazaar," replied the optimistic Nora, "and perhaps the money has done some good in going to Mrs. Rosa's creditor. I shouldn't wonder if we could get a subscription for all that we need to help the Rosas." And so Nora chattered on in her efforts to cheer Brenda, for the latter, always at one extreme or the other, was now very low spirited. End of chapter 29. Recording by Deborah Knight, United States of America. Chapter 30 of Brenda, Her School, and Her Club. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Brenda, Her School, and Her Club by Helen Leah Reed. Chapter 30. Brenda's Folly. It would make a long story to tell what everyone said on the subject of Brenda's Folly, for this was the name given it, and by this name it was long remembered, much to Brenda's discomfiture, when the subject of Mrs. Rosa and her money was brought up. There were so many persons who had a right to express an opinion, that poor Brenda felt that simply to listen to what they said was punishment enough. There were all the girls who had worked for the bazaar, and all their parents, and all the girls at school who hadn't worked for the bazaar, but had done their share of buying. There were the boys from Harvard, whose criticism took the form of mild chaffing, and there were but the list, it seemed to Brenda, included everyone whom she had ever known, and some with whom she was sure that she had had no acquaintance. Mr. and Mrs. Barlow were especially severe, and told her that she must gradually reimburse the four from her allowance. "For the money," said Mr. Barlow, "did not belong to you. You held it in trust for Edith and Belle and Nora, and indeed I wonder how they ever came to entrust it entirely to you. You are too heedless a girl to have any real responsibility, and I only hope that your thoughtlessness is not going to deprive Mrs. Rosa of the country home that Miss South and the others have planned for her." Poor Brenda! Before that fatal Saturday $200 had seemed to her very little, but now it seemed an almost infinite amount. Her father, of course, could easily have given her the sum at once, but he preferred to make her realize her heedlessness. Indeed, the lesson had already begun to befit her. For the first time in her life Brenda realized the value of money. How in the world could she herself ever save the required sum from her allowance? Why, if she should not spend a cent upon her own little wants, it would take her more than 2 years to get together $200. For her allowance, it should be explained, was large enough only to provide little extra things that she needed, or thought that she needed. She had not to use any of it for clothes or other useful purposes. Yet when Brenda began to count the things that she must give up for 2 years, or longer, it seemed as if she could hardly bear the sacrifice. But her sense of justice prevailed, and at last she admitted that she deserved this punishment. "Poor Brenda," said Mr. Barlow to Mrs. Barlow, as Brenda walked away after this interview with her head bent as if in reflection. "Poor Brenda. This lesson will be a hard one, but if we are ready to help her out of every difficulty, she will never be able to stand alone. I, at least, could not feel justified in coming to the rescue just now." After this conversation with her father, Brenda walked upstairs sadly. At least her head drooped a little, and anyone who had followed her to her room would have found that the first thing she did was to fling herself face downward onto that broad chintz covered lounge of hers. While she lay there, she did not hear a gentle knock at the door, nor the soft footstep of someone entering the room. "Why, Brenda Barlow!" cried a pleasant voice. "Why, Brenda Barlow, why are you lying in this downcast position?" At first there was no reply from the prostrate figure. Then Julia, for it was she who had entered the room, ventured a little nearer, and repeated her question in a somewhat different form. Thereupon Brenda sprang to her feet, and though she attempted to smile at Julia, there were very evident traces of tears on her cheek. "Brenda," said Julia, "you know that I am very apt to go straight to the point, if I wish to say anything, and so I will not apologize for what I am going to say. I am sure that you won't be offended if I tell you that you are thinking too much about the loss of Mrs. Rosa's money. I have been noticing you for several days." It was now about a week since Miss South had made the discovery of the loss. As Brenda made no reply, Julia continued, this time a little timidly. "Nora and Edith feel sorry that you will not take an interest in the plans for moving Mrs. Rosa to Shiloh. You know we have been out to see the cottage, and we missed you dreadfully. Belle wasn't there either. But since the bazaar she hasn't been as much interested in the roses, but we thought that you really had some interest." "Why, yes, I have," replied Brenda. She did not resent Julia's "we" in speaking of the efforts now making for the roses, although not so very long before Brenda herself had opposed having Julia considered one of the four. "Why, yes, I have an interest in Mrs. Rosa," repeated Brenda, then with a return of her old light-heartedness, "$200 worth of interest, and what bothers me is to know how to turn it into capital." You see from this that Brenda had not altogether forgotten her arithmetic. "There, Brenda, that is just what I've been wishing to speak about to you. I have been afraid that you have been worrying over this, for Uncle Thomas has told me that he has decided not to help you pay it." Again the girl to whom she was speaking seemed unlike the old Brenda, for she did not resent the fact that Julia had apparently been taken into Mr. Barlow's confidence to so great an extent. "Now, Brenda," continued Julia, "as I have said before, I always prefer to come straight to the point, and so I must tell you that the $200 has been paid to Miss South. The other girls have voted to make her the treasurer, for Mrs. Rosa's benefit." "Where in the world?" began Brenda in a most astonished tone. Then with a glance at Julia's face, over which an expression of self-consciousness was spreading, "Why, Julia Bourne, had you anything, did you, why I really believe that you had something to do with it. Did you get someone to give you the money?" "No," replied Julia with a look of relief. "Oh, no, no, I made no effort to collect money." Brenda's wits were now well at work. "There, Julia, I begin to see. It seemed funny when you paid $100 for that picture, at least I thought very little about it then, but to-day, when I was going over everything connected with the roses in my mind, it occurred to me that $100 was a rather large amount for you to pay, and I meant to ask you how it happened." Then stammering a little, as she realized that this was not a very polite way of putting things, "at least I know that I should never have so much money saved up from my allowance for any one thing. But you're more sensible than I, and of course you can make money go a great deal farther." Julia smiled pleasantly, for she understood, in spite of a certain confusion of statement, pretty well what her cousin meant. But still she did not answer immediately, and Brenda, who was now thoroughly herself, exclaimed, "Do tell me, Julia, did you give that $200 to Mrs. Rosa? That is, was it a present from you?" For a moment Julia was silent. Then she replied, with some hesitation, "Yes, yes, Although I had not meant to tell you, it is my little contribution to the plan you all have made for helping the Rosas. I have been wishing to do something, and it seemed better to give this now, when the money was so much needed, rather than to wait until later, as at one time I had thought of doing. Though I am sure," she continued modestly, "that there would have been little trouble in raising the money, only I thought that it was better for me to make my contribution promptly now, while you were—" "Then it was just to help me, so that there would not be so much fault finding with me. Why, you are a perfect angel, Julia," cried Brenda. "Hardly," said Julia, laughing, "hardly an angel, though if this makes you feel more comfortable, I shall be very happy." Brenda was on the point of asking her cousin how she happened to have all this money, for the more she thought about it, the stranger it seemed. Before she could ask a question, Julia, however, had bidden her good bye, saying that she had an engagement with Edith, and Brenda was forced to wait an opportunity for getting the information she wished from her mother. After all, the explanation was fairly simple. Brenda and Belle, without good grounds, had decided at the first that Julia was entirely dependent on Mr. Barlow. Instead of this, Julia had a good income of her own, which when she came of age would be largely increased. The girls had wrongly assumed that Julia was studying and working diligently simply because she expected at some time to be obliged to earn her living, whereas the real motive behind all her efforts was her genuine love of study. Had circumstances made it necessary, Julia would have enjoyed the teacher's profession, as a means of earning her living. In fact, sometimes when she thought about her future, she found herself regretting that she could not adopt this profession. But she knew that the ranks were already fairly crowded, and she felt that she would have no right to enter a profession that could barely support those who needed it as a means of livelihood. Brenda and Belle had made many mistakes, not only in their estimation of her fortune, but in the reading of her character. Brenda was beginning to find out her own mistakes, and when once she was convinced of a fault she was seldom slow to acknowledge it. In the end she would have been fair to Julia, even if her cousin had not established a certain claim upon her by her generosity toward the Rosas. For really by giving the money so promptly, she had saved Brenda from a continuation of annoying criticism. $200 was not an extremely large sum for a rich girl to give to a good cause, but Julia's delicacy and thoughtfulness made Brenda her firm friend. Belle, naturally enough, was not so ready to change her point of view. When she did permit herself to show greater cordiality towards Julia, it was rather because she had a full appreciation of what it would mean to her to have a girl of Julia's wealth her friend. It was hard for Belle to take an impersonal view of anything, and this, perhaps, was largely the reason why she became of less consequence in the little set which had been called the Four Club. As the others of the quartette grew older, Belle's selfishness became more and more disagreeable to them. Although there was still a quartette of friends, Julia began to have the fourth place, while Belle gradually withdrew to the more congenial society of Frances Pounder. But in saying this I am anticipating a little, for Belle retained her interest in the Rosas long enough to be one of those who helped move the little family to the little house which had been chosen for them in Shiloh. End of chapter 30. Read by Deborah Knight from the state of Illinois, United States of America. February 13th, 2011. Chapter 31 of Brenda, Her School, and Her Club. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Brenda, Her School, and Her Club by Helen Leah Reid. Chapter 31, The Shiloh Picnic. Miss South and Julia were the leaders in the work of removing the Rosas from the city. Julia showed remarkable ability, and the more she had to do, the better she seemed to do it. Nor did her lessons suffer because of this outside interest. The day of removal was continually changing. It was put off from week to week with one feeble excuse or another on the part of Mrs. Rosa. Miss South was more patient with the poor woman than were her young helpers. She realized that the poor woman could not be expected to appreciate all the advantages to result from the change, and she sympathized with Mrs. Rosa's reluctance to leave her old neighbors to go amongst strangers. Indeed, it was the end of May before they were really off. On the Saturday before their departure, the four and two or three of the other girls who had been especially interested, went out to Shiloh to see the little cottage which had been fitted up for the Rosas. It had only 6 rooms, and these were not very large, but what fun the girls had in exploring every nook and corner. Floors and walls had all been newly painted, some in rather bright colors. There were small mats in front of each bed, and one in the center of the room intended for dining room, but besides these there were no floor coverings. The bedsteads were iron, painted brown, and all the other furniture was of the simplest possible style. "I am afraid," said Julia, "that Angelina will be disappointed in not finding a piano. She has an idea that we are considering her education as much as her mother's health in making this change, and as she happens to be very anxious to take music lessons, she will expect some kind of a musical instrument if not a piano." "What nonsense!" cried Belle. "Angelina ought to be thankful that she has not been sent away as a servant. She is certainly old enough to live out." "If it were not for her mother's being so weak, undoubtedly we should make some effort to put her at service. But with all those younger children, for the present Angelina will have sufficient practice in housework, and she is to work every day for a boarding house keeper. If the family stays out here, I have a plan that will be of great value, not only to Angelina, but to the rest of them. In fact," concluded Miss South, "Angelina, if she takes kindly to the scheme, may serve as a model for a number of other girls at the North End, who stand sadly in need of such training as she will be able to get in this comfortable house." "Oh, do tell us about it now," begged Nora. "I know that you have some plan to carry out, domestic science, isn't that what you call it? But I haven't the least idea what you really intend to do." Miss South smiled at the eagerness which Nora displayed, smiled indulgently, but in reply said merely, "I am afraid that there will hardly be time now, but in the early autumn, if there is no opportunity before you go away, I am going to have a special meeting to which you will all be invited, at which I will tell you of a scheme which with your cooperation, as well as that of some other interested persons, I hope to carry out next season. There really is not time to say much about it now, for Philip and his friends will soon be here, and we must all go to work to prepare our tea." Then the girls set to work with a will, and in addition to the delicious things sent out in hampers, they prepared several dainty dishes. Many of these delicacies were the result of the practice they had had in the cooking class of the past 2 seasons. Julia set the table with the new dishes that filled Mrs. Rosa's corner closet, the closet, that is, that was to be Mrs. Rosa's. No one criticized the thickness of the cups, nor the crudeness of the colors with which the cups and plates were decorated, for by the time the boys came they were all so hungry that they could have eaten and drunk from plates and cups of tin. It was rather a picnic supper on the whole, as the table was not large enough for the group of merry young people who wished to gather around it. Some of them, therefore, sat out on the steps, and on the tiny little piazza at the corner, and laughed and talked at the top of their voices in the intervals between courses. Though each course consisted of little more than a sandwich, or a stuffed egg, or a salad, those who in turn took the part of waiters and waitresses served them with all the pomp that might have had its proper place at a great feast. It was all in fun, and the fun was of the heartiest kind. Then, when the supper was over, boys and girls, the dignified Philip, the serious Will, as well as fun-loving Brenda and Nora, set to work with energy, and washed and wiped dishes and put things in order, so that the little house showed not the slightest trace of invasion of the Goths and Vandals, as Brenda said, with an unusual correctness of historical allusion. There was a delightful drive to wind up the evening, around the borders of the lake which forms one of the attractions of Shiloh, and when just at dark they stepped aboard the train, they all declared that it was the pleasantest expedition that they had known for a long, long time. "If Mrs. Rosa were to take summer boarders, I am sure that I should love to come out here for a month," said Ruth. "I mean, if she only hadn't so many children to fill up the house so completely." "If you were to come," said Will in an undertone, "I am sure that I should wish to spend the summer in Shiloh too. I made friends with the owner of the omnibus that brought us up, and I rather think that I could get him to take me in." Ruth blushed as Will made this speech, for even she could not help noticing the decided preference that he showed for her society. It had been his actions rather than his words that had attracted the attention of the others, for he seemed in no way afraid of having his preference known. Ruth was neither foolish nor vain, but she had to admit to herself that Will's little attentive ways were rather gratifying. In the cars on the way home, Philip and Julia happened to sit together. Philip was still somewhat conscious in his manner, for he could not forget that he was a sophomore. Yet with Julia he always got on capitally, and they had really become good friends. "Do you see much of Madame du Launy now?" he asked. "I hear that you and she were great friends for a time." "Oh, we are now," answered Julia, "only naturally since she and Miss South have discovered their relationship, I do not go there as often as I did earlier in the spring." "Then the story about Miss South is really true. She actually is the old lady's granddaughter," said Philip. "I heard a lot about it just after the bazaar, but in some way I thought that it would prove to be a mistake. You know that things like that do not often happen out of books." "Oh, this is perfectly true," answered Julia, "and the whole thing is just as interesting as it can be. It seems very sad that Madame du Launy should have lived a lonely life for so long, when here was a granddaughter close at hand, and a grandson not so very far away. She could have been such a help to them, and they to her." "It shows that an old lady can't afford not to know who her grandchildren are, and where they live," responded Philip, "especially if one of them is as pretty and clever as Miss South." "Oh, well, there were special reasons in this case," answered Julia. "Then doesn't it seem queer," continued Philip, "that you yourself should have had the credit all winter of being a poor dependent? Isn't that what they say in novels? How do you feel now when you know that everyone knows that you are an heiress?" he concluded mischievously. "Oh, pretty well, I thank you," answered Julia, adopting his tone. "You see, I never imagined for a moment that people attached any importance to my having or not having money. Indeed, to be perfectly fair, I cannot see any change in any one since the discovery was made." "Whew!" whistled Philip. "Not even in Belle?" After a moment of silence, Julia replied, "I do not suppose that under any circumstances Belle and I could ever have been great friends. Our tastes are so unlike. In the early winter many little things troubled me. I often felt neglected when the four left me out of their plans, especially while they were working for the bazaar. But at length I decided that I ought not to expect Brenda to treat me at once like an intimate friend. I knew that in time she would understand me better, and this is what has really happened. But Nora and Edith were always so kind to me that I had a delightful winter." "Then pity," said Philip with a smile, "would be utterly wasted on Brenda's cousin?" "It would be utterly wasted on her," replied Julia cheerfully, "especially since she has been permitted to make a fifth in Brenda's Four Club." Chapter 31. Recording by Deborah Knight, in Illinois, United States of America, February 13th, 2011. End of Brenda, Her School and Her Club, by Helen Leah Reed.